Welcome to Cross-Examining Cyber, a podcast brought to you by Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer. In this podcast series, we talk to those industry leaders on the cyber front line, protecting companies from cyber incidents and shaping the legal and regulatory environment. I'm Cam Whitfield, leader of our APAC cyber practice. Today I'm joined by Ciaran Martin. For many of you, Ciaran needs no introduction. He is now one of the globe's leading cyber thought leaders, and he's often called upon by governments, government agencies, and the private sector alike. He's also taking a leading educational role demystifying the cyberspace. Of course, Ciaran played a very important role supporting the Australian government in the creation of our own cybersecurity strategy. My discussion with Ciaran was so interesting that we've broken the interview in two. In this part one, we talk about Ciaran's various roles, how he's become such an important voice in the cybersphere, and we also talk about the impact of geopolitics in the cyber threat. I know you're going to enjoy this discussion, including the delightful way in which Ciaran blends serious cyber issues with a keen sense of humour. Not an easy balance, I can assure you. Thanks again for listening. This is Cross-Examining Ciaran Martin. Here we go. Ciaran, welcome to Cross-Examining Cyber. Where does this podcast find you today?
I'm at my home in West Oxfordshire between Oxford and Cheltenham.
I think our audience would be very interested in your career journey. You've had a very significant role to play both in the UK, globally, but also here in Australia. So if you would indulge us, would you mind talking us through your career journey?
Well, that's an invitation to remember a story from an old colleague who once rather waspishly referred to someone else, said, yes, he's talking about himself, his favourite subject. So I'll try not to fall in too much into that trap. I guess for a podcast, and thank you so much for having me on, Cameron, I was a very late comer to cyber. I was 39 years old before I really worked in cybersecurity at all in any meaningful way. So I grew up in Northern Ireland. I studied history at the University of Oxford, and then I sort of stumbled into junior roles in the British civil service in London around the turn of the century, which dates me a little, initially in the Treasury and public expenditure. And then I got a series of jobs in national security. I was the head of office to the equivalent in Australia would be the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. So that's the sort of most senior civil servant. And I was the head of office. And this period coincided, not my fault, I wasn't responsible, wasn't powerful enough. This coincided with the great financial crash of 2007-8. Now, in this period, nowadays in Britain, you have something called the National Security Council, the National Security Advisor, and a big staff supporting that person. Back in those days, you didn't have any of that. And the Cabinet Secretary, who's the most senior official for aficionados of the ancient but brilliant British comedy Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, that's Sir Humphrey Appleby. The Cabinet Secretary is responsible for the intelligence services. That arrangement goes way, way back to the First World War and subsequently. And so that meant I had top-level security clearance and did some work with the intelligence services. During the great financial crash, my boss, the great Gus O'Donnell, now Lord O'Donnell, a Treasury economist, was completely preoccupied with the issues affecting the global financial system and doing all sorts of brilliant work all over the world with his network, playing a role supporting Prime Minister Gordon Brown in stabilising the banks. Why is that relevant? Because it was pretty full on and didn't leave much time for anything else. So at a time when there were some issues, some legal controversies actually around allegations of complicity in human rights abuses at Guantanamo and Bagram and all of that, if you remember from the global war on terror, I ended up handling quite a lot of those issues with the intelligence services about their response to those challenges. So I got deep into the world of national security. Fast forward to 2013, and a chap called Edward Snowden plunges the Five Eyes into chaos. And by this stage, I know the intelligence service as well. I'm doing a different job. I'm back in more mainstream civil service world, but GCHQ, the equivalent of the Australian Signals Directorate in SAMAR, Five Eyes Signals Intelligence Agency, asked me to come out and help. I said, well, I'm very happy to do that, I'd be honoured. But I know enough about policy crises to know that we'll succeed or fail in 6 months, but it won't last longer than 6 months. And what am I going to do after that? Because it involved moving out of London and so forth. And they said, well, we'd quite like somebody at your level to try to transform our cybersecurity operation because it's becoming more important, as well as the traditional signals intelligence role. I actually might strike listeners as rather strange. I actually lobbied against my own appointment on the grounds that I was not in any way expert in cyber. And I think this leads to quite an important conversation in terms of the way we think about it, which went along the lines of Ciaran Martin, the wonderful, legendary head of GCHQ, who'd really transformed the organization, said they were brilliant technical people, great operational capabilities, but they'd been designed for a world where they provided secret security to secret services. And now GCHQ was being asked, as ASD has been in Australia through the ACSC, was being asked to help the whole population. And we needed a new business model, and I could work with that. So at the age of 39, I moved house, moved my young family, and started essentially retraining and relearning. And I did have a bunch of absolutely incredible technical and operational people and capabilities, completely world-class. Never saw anything like it in public service. I mean, these people, occasionally we'd lose a few of them to Microsoft and Google for 3-4 times salary, but most of the time they'd stay. But they were so good. They were incredible, world-class people. But the model was, we had government services, social security, pensions, tax, passports. We had major critical businesses all trying to look for help, wanting help with incidents, wanting help with protective security. And we were there behind barbed wire in a building with no mobile phones. It doesn't work. So we needed to take it into the open. We needed a more activist approach. So we came up with the idea of what's now the National Cybersecurity Centre. And during this brief lull, British politics in the last, well, essentially since the great financial crisis, have been chaotic. It's time of real strain and fragmentation. The most important statistic in Britain in the last 20 years is that average annual real wages have not grown since 2007. So it's been a time of real strain. But there was one moment in about just after the election of 2015 and before the Brexit referendum, 13 months later, of sort of strategic stability. And that was the point, serendipitously for us, and hopefully for British cybersecurity, that the Cameron government decided it wanted to do something completely different on cyber and backed our idea for a new strategy and a new National Cybersecurity Centre. The formative moment for me, or the crucial moment for me, was so sort of first half of 2014, I did the Snowden stuff, did a bit of cyber, mostly I did the Snowden stuff. Middle of 2014, I started to really think about how to handle cyber, and we had some big incidents. And I remember there was one, it was classified, so I can only summarize the details, where we briefed Prime Minister Cameron on a major nation state intrusion into a privately owned British critical infrastructure company. We were terribly pleased with our superb technical work that detected it. He was rightly furious with us because he said, what can I do with this? And we said, what do you mean? He said, well, can we tell the company? No, of course not. It's too secret. He said, well, so you're presenting me with a problem and nothing we can do. So that was one issue. The other, given that he's currently in the news, another incident was Mark Carney, now Prime Minister of Canada, but then Governor of the Bank of England, wanted to accelerate the next phase of post-financial crash reconstruction of the system and wanted to bake in, he had a legal mandate from Parliament to bake in operational resilience, and interpreted that correctly as including cyber, and came to the government and said, I run the Bank of England, we don't understand cyber, who can we talk to? And apparently he got a 3-page letter saying, well, there's a bit here and a bit there and a bit and so forth. And he said, this isn't good enough. So that was a forcing function. And then finally in October 2014, a telco, it's our fourth biggest telco, a company called TalkTalk, suffered a data breach, which actually on subsequent investigation turned out to be not very serious. But at the time, there was this widespread panic. And the reason for that mismatch was there was no public authority, as there tends to be in other areas. We all know during COVID, we had chief medical officers. If there's a fire, you've got chief fire officers. You've got, if it's a flood, the Environment Agency boss comes out and says, here's what you do, here's who's affected. We didn't have that for cyber. So what I did was to say, look, there's all sorts of things wrong, both with our strategy and our operational model. So our strategy at the time, as with most, if not all Western countries, was to say, we need the government to sponsor public-private partnerships and get companies to share information. That's the answer. What the hell does that mean? And we've been trying it for years and years. My big moment was I went to a conference at Georgetown University in Washington, some point in early 2015. And Art Coviello, who had just finished as a very successful stint as head of the RSA company, gave a speech. And he said, he went through the first 4 US cybersecurity strategies, 2 under George W. Bush, 2 under President Obama. And he said, the key pillars both were information sharing and public-private partnerships. We haven't got it right. And I thought, this is a brilliant analysis. But I parted company, no disrespect to him, I parted company when his conclusion was we should try harder to get those right. My conclusion was maybe they're not going to work, right? So I came back. And because I had much less, I was working with people with PhDs in cryptography and tons of operational experience. And so I was really nervous, but I came back and gathered a few of the senior people that I trusted and said, look, have we got this all wrong? This is nonsense. Why are we shouting at people to share information? Why are we building committees of public and private sector leaders that don't appear to do anything? And I was waiting for them to look at me as if I'd gone mad, and I was waiting to go home and reconsider my life choices. And rather wonderfully, they all just sort of looked at each other, and then one of them bravely said, oh, thank God you said that. Yeah, we've been waiting for this. This is nonsense. We really need to do things differently. So I said, well, give me some ideas. They said, well, brand protection. What do you mean? I said, well, most cyber problems are about spoofing identity, particularly corporate identities. So we did this bit of work where we looked at, because GCHQ is a massive signals intelligence agency with lots of data, we looked what are in terms of our own analysis of cyber attacks affecting broadly the UK, what are the most spoofed brands? And the most spoofed brand in the UK was Her Majesty's Revenue, and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the tax authority. That's very good for scams. So we talked to HMRC and said, yeah, we're working on this. The only issue is, why should we do this? People don't choose not to pay tax if their brand is being spoofed. Even the retailers, Tesco's, whatever, you get a fake email from Tesco's. You don't punish Tesco for somebody spoofing their emails on. So there's no actual business incentive for an organization to look after their brand. There kind of is now. It's changed a bit, but back then there just wasn't. And then, well, is there an answer to this? Yeah, there's the DMARC protocol. It's kind of free and it's relatively easy to implement. Let's do an experiment with HMRC. So we did an HMRC DMARC experiment, and we ran it during 2016. They wrote a great blog about it, where it said essentially, if you see something, here's what HMRC's configuration on the internet looks like. If you see something that's kind of trying to look like this by email but isn't, don't deliver it. And instead of just saying don't deliver it, it said deliver it to us so we can collect it and have a look. We got 500 million fake emails pretending to be HMRC in 1 year. And that was just incredible, because that's 500 million times where somebody is sitting at a laptop, as I am now, in front of an inbox, and the fake email doesn't arrive. It's brilliant. So things like that. And we said, and things like managing incidents and so forth. We said, well, to do this, we probably need a new structure. So we can't do it from behind the barbed wire in Cheltenham with no mobile phones. We can't talk to our partners, the people we need to advise. We need a much bigger internet presence. We need to be on the telly talking to people about, securing baby monitors and things like that. So we pitched the idea. This is a bit introverted or navel gazing, but it was sort of important. When I'm asked about the formation of the NCAC, it's why did you set up the NCAC? I always say we changed our approach and then we worked out what structures we needed to do it. We didn't just, sometimes it's, there's a problem, let's set up a new organization and government to deal with it. That, in my view, doesn't work. I've seen it happen loads of times in my career. It was the strategy first. It was, we need to be more active and interventionist. We need to have an incident management function. We need to work out, like with that DMARC example, what direct interventions we can make, etc. We need to work out what we need to communicate to which type of people. And then you put together the best sort of structure. So then there was a huge, it wouldn't be government without a massive internal bureaucratic battle. The big decision was whether or not to leave it in the intelligence services or put it in a standalone organization. There were significant advantages and disadvantages to both. The advantage of keeping it in GCHQ, which is where we ended up, was twofold. One is the access to the rest of the organization, huge amounts of classified data and so forth, but also the skills and the people and the capabilities. You weren't going to be able to replicate those. And if you forced people who'd been working on a mixture of intelligence and cybersecurity in GCHQ, if you forced them to choose one organization, they'd all choose GCHQ. The disadvantage, so therefore this is something I had to mitigate, was that culturally, architecturally, institutionally, mentally, GCHQ did not want to be out there talking about anything, did not want to be a sort of accessible and visible public service. It's completely antithetical to its culture and its legal framework, indeed. So we had to work around that, because what we'd seen in other areas, including with our own attempt to set up a CERT, a computer emergency response team, it had an excellent public presence, but it didn't have access to the expertise and so forth. So that was we've sort of a hybrid model where it's an open facing unit of GCHQ. That's what the NCSC is. So all in all, that process takes you from the end of 2013, when I was appointed post Snowden, to sort of the latter half of 2020. I stayed on a bit longer because COVID and all of that, and moving the operation onto remote working during lockdown, but also frankly trying to help the country manage a massive unplanned move to remote working in 3 days, as we all did. Meant that it wasn't the right time to leave in the summer of sort of June 2020 as originally planned. The reason I left was simply twofold. One was, this was 6.5 years of full-on work. I mean, it was the most intensive working period of my career. And by the end of it, I found I was going a bit stale. So we had a strategic security review in 2015, which is where the NCSC political endorsement came from. And back then, me and my team were full of radical ideas. By 2020, I found myself defending the 2015 settlement and justifying it and saying this is what we thought, rather than being full of ideas. And I thought, well, maybe it's time to give somebody else a go. And by this stage, I was completely hooked on cybersecurity and wanted to stay there. And there's no better job in government, obviously. So I was fortunate enough to get a professorship at the University of Oxford, the School of Government there, and some private sector work, including in Australia, all of which is in cyber. So I've been able to continue with my interest in the subject, which I'm really passionate about.
And so, and where are you now? I know you're advising across a number of different organisations and advisory sort of roles. What's your role now?
So I'm a professor of practice at the Blavatnik School of Government. So I teach master's students on a Masters of Public Policy course. That's kind of like an MBA, but for government. And we have about 150 students a year from about 50 countries, including some extremely talented people from Australia. And that's where I spend most of my time. I'm doing some writing. So I'm currently writing, I hope, a reasonably accessible explainer to newcomers to cybersecurity about what the subject is and who's hacks and why and all of that. I'm the chair of CyberCX in the UK, big Australian cybersecurity company that's recently been acquired by Accenture, and I'm one half of CyberCX's Global Advisory Board, which is why I visit Australia twice a year. Actually, because of my connections to Australia, one of the most interesting things I've done since I've left, although I no longer do it, was I was asked by then Home Affairs and Cyber Minister Claire O'Neill to chair the International Advisory Committee that she was using to help her formulate what became the 2023 Australian Cybersecurity Strategy. And I think the chair of the more important domestic committee, Andy Penn, has been one of your guests. But that was an excellent process, and I thought that was a really good way of formulating cyber policy and cyber strategy. So, and then I do some other things. So I work with an investment company in cyber in the US called Paladin. I teach with and do lots of work with the SANS Institute, the big global cybersecurity training provider. I've got some work with pro bono with a large medical research charity, Our Future Health, which is trying to use the latest technology and large-scale blood diagnostics to help improve medical treatment, but obviously create some major data security challenges. So I've got a pretty full dance card.
We'll get back to the cybersecurity strategy here in Australia in a moment. Before we do, though, I just want to touch a little bit on something that I'm sure you're very familiar with, and that is the sort of geopolitical challenges that we face at the moment. And because we can't, as individual companies, we can't do much about these, but they exist, whether it's policies that are coming out of the White House, whether it's the actions of North Korea, whether it's Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. I'd be fascinated in your view about how much of a role does the changing geopolitical landscape play in this space, and how do we help our companies deal with things which they can't otherwise control but are inevitable in many respects? It's a challenging question, but I think we have to lean into it. Our corporates have to lean into it. These issues exist.
So, Cameron, firstly, you're right. We have to lean into it. You're also right. It's extremely difficult. And anyone hoping that in the next few seconds I will enunciate a really clear, compelling answer is going to be disappointed. The first thing I would say is that this is one of the most significant changes between this decade and the last decade, and from my own personal point of view, between the period I was in government and the period since. And I think this period's more difficult. So in my day, sounding old, in my day, we were still, I think, in the last throes of the period of almost unilateral US-led dominance of technology in a benign US political setting. So the US private sector, and with ARPANET and so forth, some stimulus from the US military, invented the internet. And for a while, if you think back to that holiday from history of the late 1990s, as the internet revolution started, for a while, the world thought this was the only model of internet-based technology that was viable, and it was anarchic. Governments were going to find it very difficult to control. Look back, some extraordinary statements. There is a wonderful speech by Bill Clinton in, I think, 1999 or 2000, around the end of his presidency, saying that China trying to control the internet is like nailing Jello to the wall. Well, I remember when the head of the Chinese cyberspace administration retired in 2016, there was a sort of, professional obituary for him, and one of the Western papers said, "The man who nailed Jelly to the wall," because they succeeded. Right? But for a time, there was, if you want to use a sporting metaphor, a grass sports metaphor, there was a pitch, and the pitch was built by America, and the game was played on America's pitch. And you could cheat on America's pitch like the Russians do. You could hack their technology. In fact, with Snowden, people were accusing America of cheating on its own game, etc., etc. But everybody was cheating on the US-led game. That's completely different now. So back in my day, it was all about cybersecurity was computer network security and nothing else. And even if you're running a government agency, there's very little politics in it. It was just, are you any good at this? Have you got something to add? But it wasn't like healthcare where it gets very political, or education, or whatever it is, or energy policy. It was are you any good or not? Now, with two things. One is the diversification of power online, the alternative models that China has built in particular, but also the change, frankly, in the US geopolitical outlook, the fact that we're all wondering what's the future of the Western alliance and so forth. People are asking questions that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago about to what extent does it make strategic sense to be completely locked into US cloud providers and so forth. When people are talking about, why are we all bang on about critical minerals and so forth? Well, one of the major reasons is hardware for technology. We're much, much more conscious of the role of hardware, the role of gadgets, the things that power the online world, the fact that you can put a little bit extra into hardware and so forth that can undermine the security and so forth. So it's much harder. So what do you do about it, and how do you help companies? I think actually, fumbling towards something useful to tell people, I'll pick up on something else you said, Cameron, which is you start by actually doing an analysis of what you can control and what you can't, and also what you might be able to control with others. So one of the reasons why I think we're in a slightly worse position than we might be is we're not as good at applying the power of the purchaser as we should be. But there are examples of that changing. So let's take cloud provision. In the current geopolitical maelstrom, you will now, if you're in Europe, for example, you will see all the big American cloud providers falling over themselves to tell you that they've built a sovereign cloud for your country. Now, is that fully sovereign? If you're purist about it, absolutely not. Of course it can't be. But things have got so heated that European buyers, particularly governments, are beginning to push the big providers quite hard on bits of detail. Not just locations of data centers, but how all that is constructed, what the safeguards and checks are, what the precise arrangements are for, the relationship with the US parent company and so forth. So you can never pass the test saying, well, if everything went catastrophically wrong, are there some things that could be done that would completely undermine your nation's ability to keep itself going? No, of course you can't do that. But have you made it much, much harder? Have you insulated yourself against, some further deterioration in the global outlook? Yes, of course you have, right? So you can do that. Similarly, if you take all the sort of arguments and debates about EVs and so on, and I don't think this has advanced as far as, say, the cloud debate, can you build a modern EV network that doesn't have anything with any connection to China and its hardware supply chain? Well, good luck with that, because it'll probably cost you 100 million Australian dollars per car if you want to go down that. But can you put in place a series of measures, both as buyers and as governments, which means that, look, it's going to be prohibitively difficult to drive this thing off the road through malevolent, government action? Yeah, you can. But that involves thinking in a completely different way from conventional cybersecurity, which is just about, firewalls and anomaly detection capabilities and all of that. So I wonder if, in 10, 20 years' time, we don't really use the term cybersecurity anymore, because it's very much associated with the invisible network software side, and we're just talking about tech security because it's just much more integrated.
Yeah. It's interesting, actually. I attended a lunch today, and we were talking about how cyber as a word is becoming anachronistic even as we speak, really, and that we're talking more about digital security. But the issue that we have is that we're trying to build a language, if you like, that everyone understands. And it's very hard. It's very hard to do that. And in fact, one of the biggest challenges we have as lawyers is quite often I'm in a room hearing the CISO or the chief security officer talk to the board and vice versa, and I know they're not quite understanding one another.
I think that's a huge point in my SANS work that comes up a lot. And I think, again, in this whole area of what can corporate leaders in particular control, and one of the things they can control is the way they analyze and strategize and decide upon their own risk profile. And that's a waffly and jargon-fueled statement for which I apologize. What I actually mean,
I don't think so.
okay, but what I actually mean is, and I still think, all these years on, I still think this holds. But one of the things I noticed earliest in my cyber career is that one of the biggest risks to corporate or indeed government security is leaders being too embarrassed to admit that they don't understand it, and being too embarrassed to ask questions that reveal that they don't understand it. And that's profoundly dangerous. So the worst outcome, and I think we've got a bit better at this, but it's not quite good enough. But I think in the middle of the last decade, 10, 12 years ago, it was quite common for a board level discussion essentially to run as follows. So something's permeated the consciousness that there's this new risk called cyber. It's very scary. Nobody understands it. So we'll go and get somebody expensive. We'll get some really nice PowerPoint on the screen. We won't understand a word of it, but it'll sound really good and they'll be really credible and they'll have a good brand, and we'll sign it off. And we'll all feel better about it. And they've got absolutely no idea what they've agreed at the end of it, what risks they've prepared to tolerate, what risks they've mitigated, to what extent they've mitigated them, and so forth. That's an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
They really should be saying, I'm sorry, I absolutely don't understand this. What does that do? What does that sort of mitigate? And I really think, I remember once a discussion at a high level of government, and obviously for, just historic, moral, and as well as legal obligations of confidentiality, I've got to be a bit careful with this. But I remember once in government, sitting at a senior meeting of of ministers, and I was item 2 on cyber, and item 1 was aircraft carrier procurement. Because of the way the meeting's organized, I just sat in the margins for the whole thing. So I listened to the aircraft carrier procurement discussion, and whatever the political and professional background of senior ministers, All of them had a very, very passionate and expert view on aircraft carrier procurement. None of them were experts in aircraft carrier procurement. And actually, their points were pretty good. And, analysis of the political implications, probing some of the commercials. It was a very, very functional discussion. And I think the decision of the government that came out of that meeting was improved as a result of putting a bunch of senior political leaders, despite the fact they had no background, but democratically accountable political leaders, debating all of this. Then I rock up with my technical director and we talking about cyber. Total silence. Great job, guys. Off you go. Right. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. They were scared of our subject, but they weren't scared of a different subject in which they had equally no expertise. So these are high functioning people. So are corporate leaders. My other favorite example was with a major energy company. They asked me to brief their board and they said, thank you so much for coming. We don't understand the subject and we're really scared of it and we need help. I said, fine. But as far as I understand this company, you extract fossil fuels from the seabed economically and safely, but computer network security is too hard for you to get your head around. Just ask some questions and just say you don't understand it, right? So I'm really sort of passionate about that.
I love your sense of humour. I think that sort of sense of humour, actually, if we bring that to the board table, I think that might encourage more people to ask what they consider to be the dumb question. Do you know what I mean? Because there is a bit of groupthink, and there is a little bit of intellectual snobbery that exists amongst that sort of community of chief information security officers and the like. There's a lot of acronyms, and there is, within the boardroom, I can see it from time to time, an unwillingness to raise your hand to say, I don't understand. So, yeah.
And this is all very easy to be critical, but can I give you a really good and positive, and it's a specific example because I'm allowed to use it, and it's true. So there's a guy called Chris Elliott. He's the CISO at the Royal Bank of Scotland, but he's ex-government, used to work for me. And he tells the story about the story of the ethical phishing test. It's absolutely fascinating. So, like all major organizations these days, the RBS do an ethical phishing test, and so try and improve their staff training, blah, 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 usual stuff. So they do it years in a row with PDFs. So let's go back a bit, PDFs, etc. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but roughly like this. There's a year-on-year improvement across the organization of about 10 points. So that's great, but still not zero. So you still have to work out, well, what do you do with the bits where people do click on links? But on both occasions, the recruitment team, the rate of clicking on the malicious PDF in the recruitment team is significantly higher than the group average. So a bunch of senior leaders are around discussing this. And because of the sort of shibboleths of the way in which cybersecurity is interpreted, you've got people sort of banging the table going, well, we must punish the recruitment team. They must be terrible and so forth. And so Chris asks the HR director, who's responsible for the recruitment team, says, do you like your recruitment team? The HR director says, yeah, they're great. Well, shouldn't we go and talk to them? Because if they're a high-performing team that you're happy with, it's probably unlikely that they're somehow moronic, uniquely moronic across the whole organization when it comes to PDF security. So maybe let's go and talk to them. So off they go and talk to the recruitment team. The recruitment team say, right, okay, here's a standard job ad for RBS. What does the job ad say? Please submit your CV and cover application by PDF too. So in other words, this bit of the bank, unlike all the other bits, like people sitting at counters in branches, people running online banking, they're not using PDFs, but the lifeblood of the recruitment team is a PDF. So the explanation when you talk to them for 30 seconds is blindingly obvious. And then what choice does that leave you with? It leaves you with an entirely rational business choice. Option one, leave things as they are. That's known in the jargon as tolerate risk. You know that stuff better than me. So you treat, tolerate, all that stuff. You tolerate. That's option one. Option two is maybe you get a capability or you deploy capability you've already got in an enhanced way to the recruitment team. So you say, well, that's more of high risk of PDFs than everybody else. So let's put higher focus on that. Option three is move to an online recruitment portal that eliminates the need for PDFs. And I think the decision was option two, then three. Any of those options would have been fine, and they're all completely understandable for an executive or non-exec board member with no background in cyber. Yes. I think it's a really positive example of just ask the question, why is the recruitment team higher? If staff absences were higher in the recruitment team, somebody'd say, can we have an explanation as to why that might be? Rather than go around saying, stop being sick or whatever.
This beautiful simplicity of the response. We now bring part 1 of this podcast to a close. There's more to come in part 2. Get into the nitty-gritty of the threat landscape, cyber policy, managing incidents, simulations, and good lawyering in a cyber crisis. Thanks again for listening.